and enter into his glory. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. The New Testament is not written yet when Jesus says this. The Jewish Old Testament, what they call the Tanakh, is the same as our Old Testament. 39 books, although you might combine 1st and 2nd Chronicles into one, but it's the same content in the Jewish Tanakh as our Old Testament. And Jesus is not just unpacking it, but it's like a moment of revelation. Go back and read your scriptures again, disciples. It might not look like it at first blush. But really it was about these three things, that there would be the Christ. And we've talked a lot about that. That means the anointed one, which brings up other anointed ones from the Old Testament, prophets, priests, and kings. It also means a human, a soul, unitary, individual human, the Christ, anointed by God, will come. And two, and here's the shocker, which we will dive into today, that Christ would suffer. And then three, that's not the end. He will enter into his glory. Go back and read your Old Testament again, guys. There was an article that we had to read in seminary. I forget who it was written by, but compared this to a mystery novel where you read it the first time and you think you get it, and you get to the end and there's a big reveal. And now when you read it again, you read it more smartly, and you can attend to some of the details. How did I miss that smoking cigarette on the ashtray the first time? How did I miss that? You read it more knowingly this time. And Jesus, I think that's a helpful analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but something like that is helpful. Guys, go back and read. Let me tell you what it's all about. And that's what we're doing in this series. So we've talked multiple weeks about the Christ, and I kind of summarized it there already. Let me go on to the third section here. Today we begin what was truly shocking to the disciples, that the Christ should suffer these things. I say shocking. And you might say, well, how do you know that? Because of things the Gospels say to us, like from Matthew 16. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. And you know, the part that Peter found objectionable was this suffering and death thing, and at the hands of elders, scribes, chief priests. Wait a second. All the leaders, movers, and shakers within Judaism. No. Things are going far too well, Lord. Do you remember when Peter says this? You know what happened the verses before this in Matthew 16, right? This is when Peter has his shining moment right before this. Who do people say that I am? This is at Caesarea Philippi. Who do people say that I am? Well, some say you're this, some say you're that. But who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the anointed one. He gets it. It's his shining moment. And the Lord says, Peter, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. What a blessing it is, Peter, for you to get this right. The Father has revealed it to you. It's his shining moment. And the very next moment, you can tell that Peter's conception of what the Christ, the anointed one, would do cannot involve this kind of suffering and death. No. It's shocking. for them to see that the anointed one, not just an anointed one, a prophet, a priest, a king, no, the big guy we've been waiting for. And he's going to die in infamy and shame and rejection. This cannot happen. This was shocking. The Jews at the time mostly expected that the Christ would be gloriously triumphant. Gloriously triumphant, mostly. You hear my weasel word in there? Mostly. It's true, we have some evidence of some differing messianic expectations. They didn't fully know what to expect. I know the Dead Sea Scrolls community has at least one writing that looked like maybe they expected multiple messiahs, maybe a priestly one and a kingly. They were trying to figure it out, different things. But if there's one big thing that they're most likely to believe at that time about the Christ, it would be triumphant. Probably a triumphant king, glory. And so this suffering thing did not compute. And they're not ridiculous. I don't want us to say, boy, they were silly. I would have been the same way. I really believe that. This is not ridiculous for them to believe in a glorious, triumphant Christ, because that's what I labeled number 3, right? From Luke 24 at the top. Enter into his glory. That's true. He's got to suffer first. That's the curveball for them. And so I have an example of this glorious messianic prophecy from Isaiah 11. And by the way, that appears to be maybe the most well-known messianic prophecy when Jesus came. Isaiah 11 in Second Temple Judaism at that time is maybe the most quoted. And listen to it. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Jesse's the father of David. So it looks like David's line is just a stump, but this is the kingly line. A king, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And you keep going in this passage, and the spirit of wisdom will be on him, and justice. He's going to be the greatest king ever. Wouldn't you read that and think, he's going to be gloriously triumphant? Even supernaturally so, it looks like in Isaiah 11. Next bullet, remember the various prophecies of David's throne being restored. Again, when you think of kingly Messiah, a throne, glory, all of that just automatically goes with it. A glorious, triumphant, recognized king. And there's all kinds of prophecies of David's throne. Amos 9, Jeremiah 30, I covered that a few weeks ago. Daniel 7, the Son of Man, we looked at that last week, who receives, it almost seems shocking that a Son of Man, a human, receives a kingdom that will never go away and glory. He looks like he's receiving something divine. Glorious. This just sounds like the Messiah, the Christ, is going to be glorious. All right, so here's the curveball. Jesus says the Christ had to suffer. And I'm not just revealing that to you for the first time. Go back and read your scriptures, guys. Read it with fresh eyes. There's stuff in there about the Christ having to suffer. And so the first part I have on this is the importance of the Psalms to these struggling disciples. Struggling disciples, right after the death of Jesus. How could it end like this, they might ask? Surely the Anointed One, the Christ, couldn't suffer like this. Look, he could raise the dead. We saw that 3 times at least, right? The Christ can't suffer like this. A suffering Anointed One, a suffering Messiah, impossible. That's probably their frame of mind. Then the lights come on. They start to understand. And here I'm totally hypothesizing here. One pathway could be, wait a second. Suffering Anointed One? That's Psalm 3. That's Psalm 4. That's psalm after psalm after psalm of David, who was anointed. Remember when Samuel anoints him a young boy? He is chosen and anointed to be the king, and yet he's not recognized as the king yet by the people. And worse yet, God is allowing Saul to hunt him down. Even though he's the anointed king, he goes through suffering. Suffering. The anointed one can suffer. And so to see that with new eyes, one thing you might forget, or let's put it this way. Notice how Jesus worded it. Was it not necessary that the Christ, he could have said that the Christ should die? And that's true. But he broadens it. It's not just about Christ dying, it's about him suffering. And there's a whole period of time that he suffers, of course, not just before the cross where he's whipped, scourged, but even before that, a life of suffering, putting up with us, humiliation, Nazareth, can anything come? Wait, are you the product of your mom sleeping around? It looks like that's one of the rumors about him. Is this not the son of Mary? He's referred to once. Does that mean they thought he was a bastard child? You can see how that can happen with a virgin conception, right? So, a life of suffering. And that kind of opens it up too, when you go to these Psalms of suffering. And it is an anointed one, anointed king chosen by God. And he's on the run because he's not recognized by the leaders in Israel as king. Does this ring any bells? And the disciples had their lights starting to come on, saying, this is all through the Psalms. But we didn't see it. Consider how strange it is that God had Samuel anoint David as king, yet he allowed the deposed Saul to harass him and hunt him down. Why didn't God just give Saul a well-placed tumor? Get Saul out of the way. Or have a freak accident like a Tower of Siloam, if you know that from the New Testament, a freak accident, this tower fall on him or something. Is that too hard for the Lord? But instead, the Lord had a purpose for David's suffering and these psalms coming out of it. Kill him off since David is the anointed king, but David suffered, which left a pattern for the disciples to understand. Jesus, the anointed one, would suffer too. If you flip the page, Jesus highlighted Psalm 22:1 on the cross. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That's Aramaic. My God, why have you forsaken me? He puts a psalm on his own lips. Let's read some of that psalm. I have portions of it here from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? I want to come back to Jesus. Was he saved? Listen, why are you far from saving me? Is that true or false? I'm going to come back to that. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. A lot of this is true. Pretty literally true at the crucifixion, right? Start hearing the crucifixion imagery in this. It's amazing. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Did we hear some of that at the cross? Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me, soldiers. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. I thirst, he says on the cross. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them. And for my clothing they cast lots. Where is Jesus in the Old Testament? There you go. And it's Jesus, his own lips. Shockingly, right? God, why have you forsaken me? This brings up the question. If I could just go into theology a little bit. Was Jesus forsaken by his Father on the cross? This has been a little bit of a difficult question. I like answering this yes and no. There's one part of this that's undoubtedly yes. It's simple. Could God the Father have saved Jesus from this kind of death, from the Romans, from the Jewish leaders, like he saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like he saved Daniel in the lion's den from hostile foreign powers, beastly powers? Could he have saved Jesus from this? Absolutely. So in that sense, forsaken, that's right. He didn't save Jesus. There's something undeniable. Just think about that. He died. And yet, just wait a few days, because Easter is the salvation of Jesus, right? From death, from evildoers. That is his salvation. He didn't need to be saved from his own sin. Please don't hear that. But saved from the grave. Saved to never die again, to never be mistreated again like that. Easter is his salvation. So, there is a sense where he was forsaken, if that means he was not saved from physical execution. That's quite true. But sometimes is there a sense of forsakenness that I want to say no? There is. If we imagine that to mean some kind of deep separation within the triune God. That, I mean, God the Father looking at God the Son, Jesus, right? And all of a sudden saying, I forget you, forget you, I hate you, I'm separating from you, some kind of cleavage, separation within the Trinity. I think that goes a little too far. So when I would teach my kids about this, and I try to put these, it's actually things in the Gospel of Mark and then Luke kind of putting it together, I would say, did God the Father, was he upset with Jesus on the cross? Well, he did die and he carried our sins, right? So yeah, kind of, but at the deepest level, do you think God the Father was upset with his Son really at the deepest level? No, Dad. He was pleased in his Son. And that never changed. And that's proven on Easter morning. That's how I kind of put it together. Another psalm, Psalm 69. This is quoted or alluded to 9 times in the New Testament, yet this is a psalm we might not know well. But listen to some of the things from Psalm 69. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. That's quoted by Paul in Romans 15:3. Reproaches fell on Christ. Another one. But the word that is written in their law must be fulfilled. They hated me without a cause. From Psalm 69, quoted by Jesus in John 15:25. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Quoted in John 2. Zeal for your house, the zeal Jesus had. that the temple would be a place of prayer, not a den of robbers. And for my thirst, they gave me sour wine to drink. That's John also 19:29. And that's referring or alluding to Psalm 69:21. Many times, Psalm 69. And if you search on this, I always think there's so many great resources on the internet that you can find easily. Search Psalms quoted in the New Testament. And so you'll find these tables and there's just tons of Psalms quoted. And it's amazing if you think about it, because Psalms you might think is only our prayer book, or kind of like, in some ways, a personal diary of suffering that's also a prayer book. You could think of it as just that, and yet, through those prayers, through the diary, through the suffering, through the joys, through the worship in there were so many things pointing forth. There's so many things that are prophetic about the Christ. It's amazing. And I think it's really key to the lights coming on for the disciples. And Jesus helped them by quoting Psalm 22:1 on the cross. And I think it opens up the suffering in the Psalms as foreshadowing the suffering of the Christ. But I want to end with Isaiah 53. Now, we've already looked at this, and I still think that this is probably the most amazing messianic prophecy in the entire Bible. Now, if you remember, the suffering servant is so clearly about Jesus with our Christian eyes. We talked about how our Jewish friends and neighbors aren't always exposed to Isaiah 53. It's not necessarily part of synagogue or temple reading many times. And part of that we know. I don't think this is a baseless accusation. We know that it sounds too Christian to them. Very Christian. So how is it that the disciples didn't know the Messiah was going to suffer? Because Isaiah 53 is full of that. Suffering servant. By his stripes we are healed. The Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. All this stuff. How did Peter, James, John, and the Jews at the time not see this? And as I've said earlier, there's one key answer in my mind to this. And that is what word is never used in Isaiah 53. And that is Messiah or Christ, anointed one. It's not. Instead, it's servant. And so the question is, who is this servant who suffers substitutionarily for the sins of others, but then sees the light of life, sees his offspring? That's glory. We'll get back to Isaiah 53 when we get to him entering his glory. And then you get to 54, which I'll never forget Al Grove's teaching me. Stretch out the tent pegs, Israel. We're going to need a bigger house. Because now the gospel is going to the nations and more people are coming to faith. Now that the suffering servant has died, enter his glory. It's amazing. It's all there. But not the word Messiah. That's the one thing. And I'm so glad it's not there, because if it was there, then they would know. Oh, the Christ has to die. Look at this. There would be forced fulfillment. It would cause confusion. No, this was the one thing hidden from their eyes. Who is this suffering servant? If you remember Acts 8, the Ethiopian eunuch. He asks that question. He's reading Isaiah, and here comes Philip the evangelist. And he's reading Isaiah 53, and he says, who is this? Is this Isaiah or someone else? Good question. It's the one thing that was not immediately clear. And beginning with that very passage, we're told, Philip told him the good news of Jesus. So Isaiah 53, the most amazing messianic prophecy, but did not use the word Messiah. But as it turns out, the suffering servant, and that's what we're talking about here, the suffering servant is also the Christ. Look at, I have this table to end us here from Isaiah 53, just some of the Isaiah passages. Now, I don't know if this is complete. I thought I read once that every verse in Isaiah is either quoted or alluded, Isaiah 53, which actually begins at the end of 52, I should say. But I thought I read a scholar saying that every verse at the end of 52 and 53 is quoted or alluded to in the New Testament except for one verse. I think it's like 53:3 or 2. Now, if that's true, I don't have all of them here. But isn't that amazing? That's how much the disciples in the early church were thinking about Isaiah 53 and how amazingly the suffering servant is the Christ. But some of them here I have listed. Jesus as the man lifted up. Lifted up how? Isn't that an amazing phrase? Because lifted up can mean ascended on high to the right hand of the Father, glorified, but it also means is lifted up on the cross from the earth, especially the way John uses that. Another one, evangelists like Paul, who spread the servant's message to the Gentiles. How beautiful are the feet, right? That kind of wording there, but there's something different here in Isaiah 52:15. The unbelief, who has believed the Lord? That's how this passage begins. That's quoted in the New Testament. Jesus, the miraculous healer, he has taken up our infirmity and our diseases. And Matthew says that's fulfilled in Jesus' healing ministry. He's the wounded one who heals others. Isaiah 53:5, 53:6, we like sheep have all gone astray, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Jesus who committed no sin, numbered with the transgressors. That's in there too. Amazing. So here's where I'm ending then. What was this about? This was about the shock that the Christ wouldn't just be glorified, recognized, triumphant. That's true. The Jews were not wrong for thinking that. But first, he had to suffer. Not just die, but suffer and die. Shocking to them. We see that with Peter. We see with the disciples not getting it. How was this hidden from them? They didn't see how the Psalms were about a suffering anointed one. They didn't see how the suffering servant of Isaiah is also the Christ. These things were hidden from them until Jesus gives them that important Bible lesson in Luke 24. Go back and read your scriptures a second time, a third time, and see how the Christ had to suffer before he enters his glory. All right. Thanks for listening. I will end there.